Hey, I'm Sean, host of The Gray Area. For the show this week, I talked to Mark C. Taylor. He's the author of this book right here. It's called After the Human. It's an incredible, ambitious book about the history of modern philosophy and where it went wrong and why we need a new story about ourselves, about our species, and really about our relationship to everything and everyone. It's a great read. It's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it.
Support for this episode comes exclusively from Upwork, the world's largest human and AI-powered freelance marketplace helping businesses reimagine how work gets done. Later in the show, we'll hear from a real-life Upwork customer, a business owner who says that his company would not be what it is today without the professionals he hired using Upwork. You can see how Upwork is helping to reinvent work in the AI era at upwork.com/updates. Mark Taylor, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be with you.
I'm excited you're here. This is going to be a doozy of a conversation because it's a doozy of a book. I was thinking about how to anchor this conversation, and I just decided that the best way to do it is to start where you start the book, which is with a pretty jarring thought experiment, we'll call it.
Right.
You write on I think it's on the very first page, and now I'm quoting, "How would your understanding of the meaning of your life change if you knew that next Friday at precisely 12 o'clock midnight, the human race would become extinct?" End quote.
Right. Right.
That's a hell of a way to kick off a book, Mark. I love it.
Right.
So why come out swinging like that? Why pose that question? Why do you want us right out of the gates thinking about total extinction next Friday?
Because I think it's a realistic possibility. The real urgency of this book comes out of my concern about climate change, because there's absolutely no doubt that that we are facing catastrophic effects in the very near future, and there's a complete blindness or unwillingness to confront the actuality of that problem and to address what needs to be done to dodge it if we can. So, but it's not just that. It's also the intersection of new technologies which are related to this, and the ways in which those new technologies have transformed the social, economic, and political systems. And all of this they're all interrelated. And the problem isn't just that people are not connecting the dots. People do not know the dots that need to be connected. And that's partly related to our educational system, and it's partly related to the new media ecological system that has emerged with this technology.
But it's also even more fundamentally related to, and this is the conceit of the book, right? To the way we've come to think of ourselves, the story
Right.
we've come to tell ourselves about
Right.
ourselves and what and who we are in the world and how we relate to
Right.
everything around us.
Right.
So that's hence the title After the Human, right? This book is very much about what we think being human means.
Correct.
So let's just start very simply. Well, very simply. What is the human?
This class, After the Human, that I taught, I began by asking the students two questions. One, the question you just asked me, what is the human? And two, the question of whether the students think that human beings, as they are now constituted, are the end of the evolutionary process, or if there will be other forms of life that will evolve from us. Answering what is the human is it's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer without falling into the trap I'm trying to escape, and that is the distinctiveness and uniqueness of the human. Because historically, part of what has made humans distinctive is the propensity to distinguish themselves from all else, right?
Right.
To distinguish themselves on one side from the animal and on the other side from the machine. And that is collapsing now. That is collapsing. And that part of what distinguishes the human is that we can ask the question what it means to be human. That's a level of self-consciousness and self-reflectivity, I think, that is important. So it's that level of self-reflexivity that I see as, in some ways, distinctive of the human.
So what you're saying is we have come to think of human consciousness as something special, something distinct, something almost separate from
Correct.
nature, as though we are outside of the natural world, looking down at it, trying to make
Correct.
sense of it.
Correct. I mean, that begins in the Bible in certain ways. I think there's a philosophical foundation to the Anthropocene. And I think in many ways that philosophical foundation begins with modern philosophy, which begins with Descartes. And Descartes, as everybody knows, said, I think, therefore I am. And what Descartes does is to identify human being with thinking, and everything else is a machine, including the human body. From that point on, there's always this effort to distinguish the human from the non-human. And that can be the animal, that can be the plant. And, philosophers all the way down to Heidegger will distinguish the human in certain ways. For Heidegger, the distinction of the human is awareness of death. He says animals expire, humans die. Dying is knowing there is such a thing as death.
So is it best for us to think of Descartes as the philosophical father of the modern world, the guy who gave us this subject-object split, the guy who convinced us that we are all little tiny private islands of subjectivity bopping around in a world of objects and things?
Yes, I think so. He begins the argument of defining human uniqueness in terms of human consciousness and self-consciousness. That identification of the human in terms of cognition and everything else is not being cognitive in any way. That becomes the heart of anthropocentrism. And the anthropocentrism is the basis of this Anthropocene, that everything is directed toward, in this evolutionary process, its culmination in human being. But it separates man as being unique in this sense, and human being is not unique, completely unique.
So that's anthropocentrism, the idea that human beings are at the center of things.
Correct. Heidegger, he states this in one of the best ways I've ever heard. He says, everywhere that man, and I use that word, everywhere man turns, he sees only himself. That is the world in which we are living. It's a selfie world.
I just stick with Descartes for a second to just make sure his villainy is appreciated here.
Right.
And to put it in plain language, what Descartes really does is he helps drive a wedge between the self and the world, so that the self or self-consciousness becomes the only thing we really know for certain, and everything outside our minds becomes this external thing. So with Descartes, we really think ourselves into alienation, or we think ourselves out of the natural world. Is that a decent summary of his contribution to this?
He sets up what I call an oppositional ontology, that everything defines itself in opposition. So you're right. The human is not this, not that, not that. Separates us out from, or to use your language, alienates us from the natural world.
So just to bring everyone along with us here, right? How does that lead us to this situation where we are exploiting nature and wrecking our environment, which is obviously where we started with the ecological catastrophe and climate change? I just want to draw a line from one thing to the other for the audience, so they know why this is more than a bad idea, why this actually had really terrible consequences for us in the world.
There's consequences, yes, with respect to the natural world, but also social and political and economic world.
What does that mean?
So we view the individual as what is most concrete and most real. And we see groups as formed of individuals, right? That's wrong, because there is no such thing as an isolated individual. Every individual is what it is by virtue of its interrelationship to other individuals and entities.
Can I
And
ask you, Mark, why is it so hard to see that? Why is the
I
illusion that we
don't
are just
know.
disconnected and separate so
I,
powerful?
I, it's one of many things that puzzles me. But here's what's also so puzzling is that that interrelationship affirms itself in the very effort to negate it,
Yes,
right?
that's the thing, right? Like we're so conditioned to think of ourselves this way, but it really isn't that hard to see why it isn't true, right? I mean, the idea of an individual or the idea of an I is kind
Right.
of nonsensical, right? If there isn't
It
an
is.
other, like what could it possibly mean to be an individual if you're not already in a world of
the
others?
only thing you can say about the individual is negative. The only thing that you can say about your individuality is as such is that it's not this, not that, not something else. But anything positive you say you're a man, you're a woman, you're a certain age, whatever. I Here's the issue: identity is difference. We're in the midst of this political. We're talking about politics right now. We're talking about the politics that are being debated on the floor of the Congress as we now speak, right? Because if the the only way in which you can establish your identity is by your difference from others, right?
By
That diff,
defining yourself against
in
which you're not.
yeah, or in relationship too.
So we think we're separate, but the reality is that we exist in this web of
Web,
interdependence.
web, exactly. But if you come back to climate, we're parasites on the earth. It's a parasite-host relationship. And we are in the process of destroying the host upon which we depend, right? You cut down all the trees in order to serve the economy, and we die. It's that simple, right? So in that sense, right, the interrelationship is confirmed. I mean, when the current politicians pull out of all climate accords, reinforce fossil fuel, they're destroying the planet without which we can't live.
Yeah, we'll get there. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
Because I want to get to what is more or less your alternative or your answer, right? So where we are at this point in the conversation in the book is with this philosophical problem we have, which is the problem of modernity, the problem of the modern human, right? This conception of ourselves as separate from each other and from the world, as
Right.
outside of nature. And nature is this external thing that we
Right.
can manipulate, control, whatever, right? That leads to a situation where we're both isolated from each other and from the natural world, which makes it easier for us to destroy the very thing on which we rely. Destroy the host, as you say,
Right.
parasite.
Exactly.
So if that's the problem, that's the diagnosis, what is the answer? What kind of vision of the self do we actually need? And what are the ideas that are going to get us there?
First thing I want to say is that I think ideas will help us get out of it. Ideas matter. And these issues, as should already be evident, are really complicated. We can say in this way. Another way to think about what Descartes does is that he takes mind out of nature,
Right.
makes everything but the human mind a machine. So part of what you have to do is put mind back into nature, right? And to do that, you need an expanded notion of mind and of consciousness. So then, if you're going to have an expanded notion of mind, you have to rethink what we mean by knowledge, what we mean by cognition, what we mean by intelligence, and the like. So, part of what I've tried to do in this, I mean, it's a meta book. I mean, the layers of abstraction, I know, but what I've wanted to do is to start at the actual physical subatomic level and look at quantum mechanics and try to understand quantum mechanics in terms of relationality and information processing, which I think can be done. There's a very important theoretical physicist by the name of Carlo Rovelli. He's an Italian guy who understands quantum mechanics through this notion of relationality or relativity. That you begin to see the way in which everything is interconnected. I mean, we as an organ, we are organisms of organisms, right? And all the way down at the cellular level, you know, the cell engages in in cognitive processing and making certain, because it makes distinctions different, it identifies different within its environment, which is the rest of the cell. So you begin to think through the ways in which this notion of relationality, right, works itself out from this most rudimentary level of the physical, and then you look at the biological level, right? And biological systems are information processing systems, right? I have I have diabetes, and that's one of the ways in which I began to understand this. When you understand how autoimmune disease works, right? You see that it's a coding problem and a misreading problem. And one way to understand the mess we're in now is as autoimmune disease, because what autoimmunity involves is that the body or the body politic turns on itself and destroys itself in certain way because it misreads itself. And you can trace this notion of information processing all the way through the physical, the biological, the ecological. Try to understand ecological systems as information processing systems, and then extend that all the way up eventually into plant and animal cognition, and finally technology and artificial intelligence.
Can we stick with this idea for a minute of, how did you put it? Putting the mind back in the world.
Right.
Because you have this idea in the book, the network self.
Right.
The
Right.
network self. And
Right.
you're talking about the mind and even identity, not as something we have, but something that happens, something that emerges in this web, right? What is the simplest way to describe this? Like, what does it actually mean to think of the mind as something that extends beyond the individual human? Because again, it just feels so counterintuitive. It's so hard for us to do that, even if it is the case.
So I will use the image as the web of webs for a lot of this, or networks. Think of yourself as a node within an ever expanding and changing network. That is, things are events. Everything's in motion. Everything's a process, right? Everything's in motion. And what I am constantly becoming is a function not only of what I have been and what I anticipate, but of my relationships to others at this particular moment, to my relationships with others in there, right? And ultimately, the whole entire web. I mean, there are different ways in which you can understand part and whole. To understand the part, you have to understand its relationship within the whole, and how that is constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly shifting. And so, what you are and what I am is changing as we speak. Everything is what the Buddhists, and I hesitate to get into a lot of Buddhism because I haven't studied it in detail. Everything is codependent and co-emergent. I am what I am by virtue of my place within this web. And
part of the problem here is, I think you alluded to this earlier. We're sort of trapped in our language. I mean, if I think of my head or my mind, again, the word's right there, my. I think of my mind. It is my head, and my brain is the container for this thing we call my mind. And is that what you're talking about here? We got a shifting away from this idea of the mind as a container to mind as connection.
Yeah. I mean, it's simple. I mean, another way to put this is, this sounds simple, but it's complicated. Everything is connected. Everything is interconnected. And you need an expanded notion of the mind, right? That to understand that there are alternative intelligences, right? There are different forms of intelligences, of which ours is a part, right? Of which ours is one particular kind. But I mean, there's some really, I mean, I know it sounds off the wall, but there's some really interesting scientific work being done on plant communication. I mean, Richard Powers' Overstory is an example of that. But that book is based upon the work of Susan Simard, his book, Searching for the Mother Tree, in which she develops a scientific study of how these trees interrelate. And she had a lot of trouble getting any acceptance of that. And, you know, to think differently is to be different. And there has to be some kind of a recognition of this vital interrelationality, or 99.9% of the species that ever existed go extinct. So we're not unique, and we can go extinct as well.
Vox Creative.
This is advertiser content from Upwork. Brian Goltzman says his company started the way most do, as a side hustle.
What we say is we're a physical marketing company. Liquid Screen Design, merch, or promotional products, or swag, whatever anybody calls it, that's what we do.
But after 7 years of profit, Brian and his business partner had to decide if liquid screen design could become more than a hobby.
We were talking about it, and we said, we have to make $300,000 in the year in sales. Okay, how are we ever going to do $1,000 a day in sales? We realized it could not just be the two of us, and we needed to start hiring additional support. We started hiring artists through Upwork. It has been such a game changer for us. You know, it's not just fixing a logo that you already have, but it's also full custom design, anything from caricatures of people to logo redesigns to unique products that we're speccing out. We can do things that a lot of other people in our industry can't do because we basically have created our own art department. It's about getting the best possible talent wherever they are in the world.
What started out as a side hustle turned into a thriving business.
At this point, we have 30 employees. 9 of them are what we call global talent. They're full-time employees of Liquid Screen Design, but they've been hired, and we manage the whole process through Upwork. We could not be what Liquid Screen Design is today without our Upwork freelancers.
Smarter work starts here. See how Upwork can help your business grow at upwork.com/updates.
For me, the relationship between thought and action isn't always so neat. I've spent a lot of time, you mentioned woo-woo types, right? Like I've spent a lot of time around Western woo-woo new agey types.
Right.
And boy, do they love to talk about Buddhism and meditation and how transformative it is. But I have seen time and again how easily these same people manage to take on all this wisdom and wear it like an ornament, only to end up even more self-centered. So I guess I'm asking if even if people chasing wisdom fall back into these ego traps, what does it really take to move from theory to practice, or from belief to behavior? Because the theory part is easy. The practice part I find to be much harder.
Well, I'm not so sure the theory part is all that easy.
Well, I mean, it's easy to say. It's easy. I guess let me put that differently. It is easy to say that we live in this world of interdependence and codependence, and I am not an I am related eternally to everything around me, and how transformative that belief is. But then I'll get up and I'll have my coffee, and then I will moonwalk into a world, into a culture, almost every part of which is designed to reinforce the illusion that I am an ego, that I am separated. And so you can read the books, you can recite the ideas, you can even believe them, but then you go out into the world and you just kind of go back into the default, if you know what I mean. So that's what I'm asking.
I mean, it's a vision. I mean, Hume always said he was a skeptic as long as he was in his study, but he stepped out in the world, and he can no longer maintain skepticism. I mean, I want to say two things. One is that I believe thinking is a form. It's not a sharp. Thinking is a form of action in certain ways. But your point is well taken. And I guess one of the ideas I wish I could get more people to understand is positive feedback. So positive feedback isn't getting good reviews on your book, your podcast, your classes. Positive feedback is related is related to these complex systems that where change accelerates, right? And the popular term for that is reaching the tipping point, and then there's a major shift. There's a pile of sand, you add grain after grain, you know there's going to be an avalanche, but you don't know when it's going to occur. Right? And it's that, I mean, that's the bind we're in now, not just with respect to climate, but with respect to, these systems work the same way. They're isomorphic across media. Financial bubbles and climate change work the same way. So my problem is how do you convey the urgency of the situation without making the situation hopeless, and using these ideas then to enact the kinds of changes that need to be made, right? But until you understand the nature of the problem, you don't see the urgency with it all.
We're talking about a problem that may have began as an individual problem, which raises the difficult question, how the hell do you solve a cultural problem? It's easier for an individual to change what they do and how they think, but it is a lot harder to change a culture. And if what you're saying is true, and I think it is for the most part, if we don't change at a cultural level, then nothing matters, really.
Nothing matters. Look, I graduated in 1968, and the world was pretty dark at that time. The war in Vietnam was going on, draft deferments were on, racial riots in the town I grew up in, student suspicion of a university and so on. There are very, very interesting similarities between the student left of the 60s and the far right today. When you look at it, it's weird. But one of the differences between where we were in 1960, people I knew and was involved with, as a Wesleyan and then at Harvard, and my students in the last years of my teaching, is we believe fundamental change could occur. Young people today, many of the young people today whom I have contact, don't. Yeah. And my question, as I taught, and yet they're smart and they know when I back off and when I'm not being honest with them. But how can I be honest with them about the crisis I believe we're in without leaving them hopeless? And hopelessness is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, for my students, my children and my grandchildren and others, either we figure this out, the way in which we need to address this, or they have no future. My grandchildren just came last night here in Massachusetts for a visit, and my grandson Jackson is now 11, and during COVID, they were here for a while. And one day he was sitting on the deck. We live in the mountains. And Jackson, who was only 7 at the time, said to me, "Grandpa, maybe the world would be better if there were no humans." And I said, "Jackson, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, Sadie," that's their dog, "we keep her on a leash. And we eat turkeys and cows and pigs. And if we weren't here, they could roam freely." And I said, where did you think of, why are you thinking that? Did you talk about this at school? He said, "No, I just thought about it." Now, what does that say? That a 7-year-old is thinking, I don't know where he got it, but it's in the ether. right?
Right.
And how do we convey a sense of hope and mission? Because that's what it is. It's
Well,
mission in a way that will, I mean, and writing a book like this, granted, it's not going to change it, but it's an effort to say, if we look at the world this way, different kinds of actions follow.
in these sorts of conversations, I'm trying to imagine myself on the other side as an audience member
Yeah.
listening and wondering, okay, now what? What do you want me to do?
Right.
And I guess what I'm wondering is if someone reads your book or someone listens to this conversation and they think, okay, I am intellectually going to make this shift from individualism to relationalism, right? I'm going to stop thinking of myself as this separate I in a world of others and think of myself as part of this web, as codependent on all of this.
Right.
What then? What concretely, how differently should someone live? Like, what do they do differently in their life once they've made this shift, right? What does it look like?
Well, again, let me speak as a teacher and what I've
please.
experienced in that way. I taught most of my career at Williams College, which is an undergraduate liberal arts college. And the last 20 years, I taught at Columbia, which is, everybody knows Columbia these days, right?
Right.
And in all honesty, I always enjoyed teaching undergraduates more than graduate students and I've written a lot of heavy duty criticisms of higher education. A lot of them got me in big time trouble. But one of my criticisms of university teaching is it's a process of cloning. You produce people to do what you do. And ever since I was in the business, the job market in academia dried up in 1970. And it hadn't been a realistic possibility to have a job. So I would always tell my students, don't do what I do. Do what I could never imagine doing and come back and tell me about it. When I stopped teaching 2 years ago, we had a gathering, about 50 of my former students, dating from my first year to my last year. So people range from 72 to 22, which is really an interesting kind of thing.
Yeah.
And those, there are countless others that you don't know what happened. But they have gone into, some went into teaching. There are doctors. There are lawyers. They're not doing what a lot of doctors and lawyers are doing. One of the most remarkable students I ever had was a refugee from Cuba. He works in media, Telemundo, and the like. We have some working in theater. There are different ways. And then I think there are enormous possibilities in these technologies that also pose a significant danger. And so there are corners, there are startups. You fail sometimes. Steve Case, who was the head of AOL, he was a student of mine, right? He could have done different things with what he created. I started, the most political, if you will, or form of action that I took based on these ideas was that I started a company with a big New York investment banker by the name of Herbert Allen in 1998 called Global Education Network. And I started webcasting my classes in 1996 when nobody was doing it. And in 1992, I taught a course using teleconferencing with Helsinki. And at that time, I thought that the world would be a better place if everybody could sit down around the table and talk about Hegel or Nietzsche, right? And that this would bring
Who
us
among us
together.
hasn't had that thought?
Right. And we tried, and the man I did this with, he put $27 million into that effort, and we failed. And I had a vision And it was all based upon this idea of networks, to make education more widely available through these technologies. Now, what I didn't understand, and I don't think many, if any, did, was that these technologies that connect also separate, right? And but there was an example of trying to put the ideas into action in a way that would bring us together in certain ways. There are ways in which you can do it if you understand, if I may put it this way, the nature of reality and the urgency of the problem.
Support for this episode comes exclusively from Upwork, the human and AI-powered freelance marketplace that says they can help your company connect to expert talent using AI-native tools, so you can scale faster, smarter, and more efficiently. One of those tools is Uma, Upwork's mindful work companion. Uma can help streamline the process from start to finish, from generating job descriptions to filtering candidates and facilitating team communication. Uma can even help the freelance professionals you hire by supporting proposal writing, project management, and features to focus less on busy work and more on the high-value work they were hired to do. And when you sign up with the Business Plus, you'll get access to Upwork's top 1% of talent, freelancers who've been vetted for their skill and reliability. Upwork will even send a personalized list of freelancer recommendations within hours of signing up. As AI becomes a bigger part of business, Upwork is here to help you not just adapt, but thrive in this new world of work. Check out what Upwork can do for your business at upwork.com/updates. That's upwork.com/updates for more information. Do you worry that AI might change our understanding of humanity in even worse ways? That we will just gradually come to think of ourselves more and more as machine-like?
Absolutely. This is a longer conversation in terms
Because
of...
I worry about that.
Yeah. Look, this man, Herbert Allen, that I mentioned, not many people have heard about him, but he is enormous. He's my neighbor here in Williamstown. And he has a conference that he and now his son have been running in Sun Valley that brings together the people running the world: technology, media, entertainment, sports, for 5 days, and their families for 5 days. And we were there when before Bezos was Bezos, in all of that. Warren Buffett. These are really smart guys, but they have a very narrow vision of the world, and they know what they're trying to create, right? And Trump does not, in my judgment. Vance does. Vance is the bigger problem. But it's Peter Thiel. I don't know if you've run across him or not. You should. He's a follower of Rene Girard, Stanford. Thiel is a really powerful person. There's a philosophy behind that. Mark Andreessen and these people, they have a vision. And I think that what they understand is that whoever controls AI runs the world.
Well, no, Thiel is
just
okay.
Just to answer your question. What is happening now is creating a condition of what I call algorithmic authoritarianism. We're being programmed. That's not new. The first critic of modern media was Kierkegaard, a book called The Present Age. For him, it was newspapers. But I assume you've seen the film The Social Dilemma.
I have.
They're programming. They're programming us in certain way, and that's taking control in ways. And so, yeah, I think there are serious dangers.
Well, we started the conversation talking about death.
Right.
And you mentioned Thiel. Thiel was just on Ross Douthat's New York Times podcast. I don't know if you saw that. And
of course.
It's a doozy. But there was one point at which, and it was very revealing, Ross basically just asked him straight up, like, do you think the human race should continue? and and he treats it like a gotcha question. I mean, he has to pause for a considerable amount of time before he can muster an answer to what should be like the mother of all, yes or no's. And it speaks to, well, a lot of things, but there is this kind of techno-salvation, techno-utopianism, anti-humanism. You talk about this a lot in the book, this idea that we're going to build these tools and we're going to upload our minds and we're going to escape all the problems that come with being mortal meat bags on this planet. I mean, is that...
Listen, it's
does that just feel like an old story in a new disguise to you, and also a problem for us to... Okay.
It is. It's what I call techno-Gnosticism, right? Andreessen is a really important player in this. I don't know if you know him or not. There's an absolute view of the future that these guys have. And Andreessen has a book, it's a manifesto, it's worth reading. And part of this human, so the first line of the book is all serious philosophies of meditation on death. For these guys, and again, they are guys, death is an engineering problem.
Right.
And, Heidegger defined, authenticity as being toward death. But, this whole notion of the singularity in Ray Kurzweil, live long enough to live forever, that they really believe that in anti-aging stuff, and they do believe that the human life cycle can be expanded considerably, if not infinitely.
Well, talk about thinking yourself out of the natural world.
Exactly.
If the end result of a line of thinking is that we come to believe ourselves outside of as immortal creatures that can escape our own finitude,
but think of it this way. If you go back to the early years of Christianity, Gnosticism was one of its greatest competitors. And the word gnosis means knowledge. And Gnosticism was a radically dualistic understanding of being, that the world was completely evil, and the whole point was to get out of this world, right? And the body was divided between mind and soul, get the mind out of the world. And the way the world was, there were concentric spheres, and each sphere, they said, had a password, had gnosis, took a certain kind of code to get you out of it. And you gradually became more and more detached from the world, right? That's what this Mars exploration is about. Gnosis is the code that is going to get us to Mars to populate the universe, because what's going to happen? They're convinced this world's going to go to hell, right? It's a complete eschatology. Religion is most interesting where it's least obvious. As you said, it's an old story in a new version. That's what all this, there are a lot of other things going on with the rockets, but that's certainly part of it. Don't Look Up. The film.
Yeah.
So there's this escapism, right? Which is a nihilism, right? The real is always elsewhere, right? There's a profound nihilism. The last words of After the Human are amor mundi, love of world, right? I don't believe there's an afterlife. I always tell my students I do believe in ghosts. Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are my ghosts. I'm writing a play now called Spectres of Philosophy, a ghost story. And I also told my students that I will haunt them for their lives. That's the way we live on in the lives of others.
If individualism is an illusion, and we are part of this
Right.
web of life, does death mean something different than what we normally think it means? It's the end of a certain kind of subjectivity, right? But is it more transformation than
I think it does.
the end?
Sort of, but look, just as I was beginning to write the section on consciousness, or plant and animal consciousness. My younger brother fell into a coma for 3 weeks and died. Um, um, and it wasn't fully clear whether he could understand some of what we would try to talk to him about in this comatose or quasi-comatose state. And it wasn't clear as to whether we were going to have to make a decision about termination of life. We had to make that decision about my mother years earlier. But in her case, her brain had exploded. That wasn't really a decision. And here I am trying to figure out mind-body problems, consciousness problems, and the first time I entered that hospital room when he was in this comatose state, and this was like 2 days before, this is like the night before I taught my last class in 50 years. He was hooked up to more machines than you can imagine. And I mean, you see the fragility of life.
Yeah.
And with my brother, everything, you adjust the dial to fix one thing and another thing gets out of whack. First time I walked into that room, he is in his comatose state, and his heartbeat increases. What is life? How do you define death? Where's that line? The more interconnected we are, the more fragile everything becomes. And understanding how that is.
And also sacred, how much more sacred everything else becomes.
Yeah, and my training is in religion. I've written many, many books on theology and the like. God talk is complicated because of the images that people have of God and how you stay away from, evangelical crazies on one side, New Ages on the other side. So I'm always hesitant to invoke the notion of God, but there is a way, and I'm trying to get back to your question about does it change the way that we are part of this web, right? And uh, uh, and I'm fine with talking about God or the sacred, and religions east and west can do that. I mean, what Hegel called the absolute was this web. And remember, I said the absolute was was Geist. The way he understood the third person of the Trinity was this kind of pervasive spirit, if you will. But that doesn't have to be some kind of mushy stuff. All these, complexly interrelated particles and bits, we are events. And Hegel's definition of the absolute is as close to the notion of God as I can come, and that is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away. We're a moment in that.
Well, to bring us back where we started, that
Right.
thought experiment about imagining the end next week,
Right.
Memento mori, right? Remembering death. Do you think
Exactly.
we have simply created a form of life in which it is all too easy to not think about death, and not thinking about death, not maintaining a relationship to death is an easy way to take life for granted. And if you take life for granted, well, you'll abuse it and the things that make it possible. I mean, is that a fair summary?
That's fair. I mean, I also 20 years I always say I died without dying. I mean, I had a biopsy for cancer and went into septic shock, and Uh, yeah, I've been there. And, the strange thing for me was that it was a strangely liberating experience. And, sometimes the only way to hold on is to let go, right?
Yeah.
How does one let go? And learning to let go is one of the hardest lessons of life. Right? Um, and but when you're able to do it, right, life comes back to you differently. Right? Kierkegaard talks about 2 moments of infinite resignation, which is the withdrawal, and then the movement, what he calls faith, which is living in the world as gift. Right? We're not given tomorrow. We're not given this afternoon. You may die this afternoon, as might I. I taught a class at noon, and I taught Derrida's Gift of Death, which he wrote at my urging. At 7:00 that night, I was near dead. That's how fast it happens and how fragile it is. And, if you can convey the sense of the fragility and the beauty of this world, what more do you want? What more do you want?
Do you think we'll turn it around? It's a bit of a ridiculous question, but are you
I have to.
hopeful to use that word again? Are you hopeful that we can
So-
course correct?
I've been jotting down aphorisms. I'm up to about 500. And one of them that I like the best is, hope is an act of defiance. We have to hope.
What are you defying?
I'm defying the way the world is heading. I'm defying what is happening, not only in this country, but throughout the world. We're heading to the precipices, and it's a willful blindness that doesn't recognize that. When the ocean temperatures off the coast of Florida are 103 degrees, marine life dies. Marine life dies, and life on Earth changes. Right? When the fires burn, we're here in Massachusetts. We had smoke and haze from Canadian fires again this summer. The world's on fire, literally is on fire, right? And given the nature of positive feedback, right, faster gets faster. And in many ways, what we need, much of what needs to be done is known. But the absurdity of the moment is that we are destroying the organizations, the companies, the rules, the regulations, the universities that can address these problems.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at earlier. Maybe I didn't say it quite
Suicidal.
right.
It's suicidal.
The gap between
Right.
knowing and doing, which is really the gap between knowledge and wisdom.
Right.
We know
That's
everything.
absolutely right.
We know
That's
everything we need to know in order to do what we know we ought to do, and yet
Right.
we cannot do it, or we seem unable to do it. And it's not just because of individuals making poor choices; it's because we've created a culture and a set of incentives and disincentives that push us
Correct.
in the direction that we're going.
And I do think that intelligence and even wisdom have, I think that what they are involves this ability to see connections where others don't see it, to see these interrelationships. You can have knowledge, you have information without knowledge. You can have knowledge without intelligence. In some instances, you can have intelligence without wisdom. There's a hierarchy.
That's right.
You go from cognition to consciousness. You can have and knowledge, intelligence, right? We need to define what all those are. And then you're going to have wisdom. And, wisdom is in some sense, I think, trying to understand how this all fits together and how we are an integral, and that's the word, integral member of this, of this web. And that web is constantly moving. I wrote a little book called Intervolution. I thought I made it up, but Milton used the term rather than evolution, because evolution is an unfolding. Intervolution is an interweaving. Everything develops by this process of intervolving and interweaving and interconnecting. And there will be new forms of life that evolve, right? I don't think human life will go away. But it's also very possible, that we will bring about our own extinction. And I cannot look Jackson in the eye and say, that's okay. And I don't believe anyone can really do that. And when I posed that question about the world ending next Friday, it was to try to convey the sense that you indicated of the certainty of death. And for me, that experience of dying without dying liberated me. It makes life more precious in certain ways because of its fragility.
So maybe the real question isn't what would we do if the end came next Friday? Maybe it's what would we become if we lived like that were true?
True. That's a better way of putting it.
Thank you to Upwork for supporting this episode. With Upwork, you can hire hourly, set a fixed price, or pay by the milestone for bigger products. You and the professionals you hire will have access to Upwork's mindful AI integrations at every step to work faster and smarter. To see what Upwork can do for your business in the AI era, go to upwork.com/updates. That's upwork.com/updates for more information.